Welcome to Essentials for Adoption-Attuned Parenting, a podcast exploring how parents can best relate and connect to their adopted child. If you have adopted, or even if you are thinking about adopting, this is the show for you. Discover tips and tools for adoption-attuned parenting. This is the podcast for building a strong foundation for your adoptive family. And now, from Growing Intentional Families Together, here are your hosts, coaches and adoptive parents, Susan David and Gayle Swift.
Hi, this is Susan from San Diego. Welcome to the Essentials for Adoption-Attuned Parenting. We're so glad you could join us. As always, I'm here with my co-host, adoption coach, author, adoptee activist, and my colleague at Growing Intentional Families Together, Gayle Swift. Good morning, Gayle.
Good morning, Susan.
As you know, Gayle, we taped this particular episode that we're going to broadcast early last month, but instead of posting it as we usually do during the third week of the month, we instead rebroadcast an earlier discussion. I think it was December of 2021. We thought that would be appropriate given the family and friends that were gathering for Mother's Day celebrations and attending graduations of all sorts.
Yes, that episode focused on our suggestions on how to, quote, handle your family and friends at celebrations. You know, the odd comments, inappropriate, uncaring, or unintentionally hurtful remarks, or some pushy, manipulative behavior that sometimes occurs when friends and family get together.
Those things do happen. So it was a good episode to broadcast. What are we going to talk about today?
So today, Susan, although the Mother's Day holiday is behind us, I think it is still valuable to focus on mothering. I'd like to chat with you about how we can nurture healthy, respectful relationships between ourselves and our children's birth moms. There are so many competing emotions in adoption, and all three parties wrestle with fear of rejection, of not being good enough. It could be easy to fall into seeing one another as competitors, sometimes even as adversaries. How much better would it be if we can actually see ourselves as allies joined by a common mission? And that mission would be to ensure the health and well-being of our kids. So let's get started and broadcast our discussion for that discussion recording.
All right, I'm looking forward to listening to it all over again.
Me too, Susan. How much better would it be if we can actually see ourselves as allies joined by a common mission? And that common mission is to assure the health and well-being of our children. To me, that feels a lot more comfortable. What do you think?
I agree. That word ally, I think that's so important to focus on that as we raise our children, and even beyond that when they're adults. What I know, though, is it's probably not easier, but it's more natural to think of ourselves as adversaries or competitors. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, how we can move into that ally position. Now, it sounds like a little bit like we're heading to stormy seas in discussing this, but we do have the equipment to navigate these stormy seas, and that's adoption-attuned parenting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we have these more difficult discussions, we think, and we hope our listeners will understand, it's perfectly okay to talk about these trickier topics, even if we feel uncomfortable, or sometimes we feel uncomfortable about doing so. So let's wade into those waters together.
Absolutely. You know, I think that sense of having a space where we can be truthful about some of our mixed emotions and our harder emotions. Not every feeling we have or every thought we have as parents, as adoptive parents, is pretty. I mean, we're human beings. Sometimes they're messy, and sometimes our insecurities drive us to think and feel in ways that are complicated.
So let me ask you, why do we accept that it really has to be so complicated a relationship between adoptive and birth moms? I mean, what factors make that the case?
Gosh, you know, I think it is inherently complicated. No matter how similar we might be to our children's birth parents, the fact of the matter is our families were created on the basis of the fracture of the birth family. So the birth moms at some level are feeling the loss of the opportunity to parent the child they created. And that's hard. And I think even as we're in the joy of parenting, as complicated as that might be, but even as we're in the joy of parenting and experiencing that role, part of us is mindful that this opportunity came through the sacrifice of our children's birth mothers. And it's kind of hard to admit. We don't want to admit that little reality that, guess what? Their lives didn't start the day they crossed our threshold. Their lives started when they were inside their mother's wombs. And whether they came to us as minutes old babies or infants or toddlers or teens, they have a life that preceded their life in our families. And I know for me, one of my regrets was that I didn't carry my children in my body, that I couldn't nurture them from the very moment that they were conceived and chat with them while I was pregnant with them. And that's I don't know whether it's regret, but it's a sadness for me.
You mentioned the important to remember that they had a life before you showed up. And that has to be acknowledged not only during the raising of the children and at different times in their life, different life cycle moments, middle childhood into puberty. Beyond that, I know with my own children, as they begin to look for partners, there are certain feelings come up for all of us, for us as adoptive parents and for my children who happen to be adopted. Well, I think you mentioned why it's complicated. It's natural. It's a natural thing to be complicated. There's mixed emotion, and they did have a life preceding us. So how does that show up in our kids? Am I clear on the question?
Oh, yeah. And, I would say in a similar way, no matter how well they fit into our family, no matter how happy they are in our family, there is a reality about their life that they have this biological family that even if they're not present in their life through open adoption or through being physically present through communication, whether it's in person or email or Zoom or whatever, even if they're not present physically, they're present in our children's minds and thoughts. That's just natural. And to think that they're not going to think about their birth family and their birth parents, I think is naive at best and unhelpful too, because then we're kind of forcing our kids to pretend that they don't think about what's often referred to as the ghost kingdom, their original family. They will think about it. And how much better if they can feel comfortable enough to say to you, you know what, Mom, today I'm missing my birth mother. And instead of us breaking down into tears, thinking we're not good enough, how much healthier and more nurturing to say, oh gosh, I know that must be hard for you. And then in the privacy of our own room, maybe acknowledging that there's a little tweak inside our hearts when we hear that we can't be a complete replacement for their birth parents. It's just not possible. And so we're setting ourselves up for failure, and we're setting our kids up for a false reality when we think we can be 100% of what they need. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. What I was wondering about was this idea that, well, you talk about it in our notes. You said that research has affirmed what many adoptive parents have observed. Their kids have something like I love this, a sensitivity meter or a radar, or maybe it's something like something in the air, perfume in the air, when it comes to rejection, right? And that's because now why I'm thinking about this is I'm listening to this as an adoptive parent, and I'm thinking there are two mothers here.
Mm-hmm.
We have to think about the birth mother and the birth parents and the family that came before, the ghost kingdom, as you talk about. So there's a fear of rejection for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will our kids love us? Do they care about us? All of that's just a thing that happens. But now I want to switch to thinking about, as you mentioned, our kids have this fear when it comes to rejection. So I asked myself, well, how, and you asked it, how does this show up in their lives?
When you think about it, it's really quite logical. At some level, they understand that their first family decided or were compelled not to make room for them and to make an adoption plan for them. And even if intellectually they can see why there are a lot of factors that made that decision reasonable, emotionally, it still hurts. It still feels personal. It still feels unsettling. And so as a consequence, I mean, it's considered one of the 7 core issues of adoption, the sensitivity to rejection. As a consequence, part of them is unconsciously thinking, and of course it's not true for absolutely every adoptee, but for most, part of them is thinking, never again is somebody going to reject me in such a way that so totally upends my life or feels so totally rejecting, you know. So as a consequence, they're kind of always vigilant about, is someone going to reject me? And this can show up in terms of if they have friends and they sense the friend is pulling away, even if it's still a healthy relationship, often they will sabotage that relationship or walk away from it just in case. So before that friend could reject them, our adopted child might reject the friend. And as they get older, the same pattern can show up in their relationships with intimate partners or dating partners. It's like, oh no, you're not going to get me. I'll always be sure I'm going to dump you before you dump me. Intimacy issues or issues with intimacy is also considered one of the 7 core issues of adoption. And it's important, it's part of our education process as adoption attuned parents to learn about these 7 core issues of adoption and not to kind of take an overly positive stance, which is so easy to fall into, of not my kid. You know, maybe most adoptees, but not my kid, because our kids need to face reality and to be kind of detectives on the alert for incidences where any of these 7 core issues of adoption are showing up. And rejection and intimacy are 2 of the biggies.
One way we might see this fear of rejection showing up in their life could be an ambiguity about finding out, about searching for their birth mother or finding out information or searching. And one moment it's a go, let's do it, I want to, and the next moment, maybe not. There might be curiosity in middle childhood, but as we move to adolescence, I think that the desire to know more or even to meet is greater. Like I said, there's an ambiguity there. One moment, yes, next moment, no. So it seems important for us as adoptive parents to create the space for thinking about their child's first family, about our child's first family. That's what you've been talking about in adoption attunement, that they had a life before you. That's important to age appropriate, of course, important to acknowledge that and to work it in, you know, the idea, the thinking about it as they grow.
Absolutely. And you talk about creating the space. Yes, we create the space, but we don't create the agenda. We let them lead the agenda in terms of when and how they reconnect, because some adoptees are not interested, very few, but some are not interested. Many adoptees voice an interest, like you said, in adolescence, but then when it comes to actually begin the process, they kind of put on the brakes for a while, because I think intuitively they know this is a big deal and maybe I'm not ready yet. So the timing absolutely has to be theirs. The creation of the space is partly ours, and it's a big responsibility. Because let's face it, part of us is kind of thinking, oh no, once they meet their birth mothers, they're never going to be interested in being with us. And that's part of that either or mentality that we try to teach people to surrender and instead embrace in adoption and attunement parenting, the idea of both and parenting. Just like we can love more than one child, they can love all their birth relationships as well as their adopted family relationships. It doesn't need to be either or, winner and loser. With both and, everybody can be a winner.
I love what you said about just like we can love more than one child in our family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something to think about or to really reflect on as adoptive parents, with knowing that our children may have a second, I'll say a second shot at their first family, right? That life-changing event at the beginning, you can like comes full circle. They can have a life-changing event as they reunite. I'm not promoting it. I'm just making the comment. So I don't want our listeners to think, yes, reunification, do all of that. Everybody's different and circumstances are different. But you have to know that your kids are thinking about their first family, even if they don't say it.
And when we talk about this commonality of all three of us fearing rejection, if we see our children's interest in their birth family history, ancestry, in having relationships, if we see that as normal and reasonable, then it's not as threatening, because we see both and we see it doesn't mean they're leaving us in the dust. It means we're all moving forward together.
You gave me an interesting statistic from attorney and coach Karen Caffrey. She wrote in her essay, when your birth mother says no, I'm making up, it's her birth mother says no about, hey, I don't want to have a relationship.
Right.
But that's a fear that adoptees have when they go into search. But this happens only in like 1 to 5% of the cases. So, but still adult adoptees who consider reaching out to birth parents are well aware of this possibility. And I would say that it's magnified.
Mm-hmm.
And you just mentioned we worry about whether we might worry if our kids are going to still love us. Is there room for me in this equation now that you found you have a relationship with your birth family? Is there room for us? I think the adoptee thinks about that too. Do you still want me? Am I still here for you? Or do you think about me? So I can imagine this would be painful for any adoptee.
For sure. And I know personally some adoptees that have been rejected by their birth mother for a variety of understandable reasons, but it still hurts. Actually said to me, I still feel at age 35 like my birth mother's dirty little secret. And that's a pretty unpleasant and hurtful experience. By the same token, I think we can have empathy for the fact that making an adoption plan for one's child is absolutely a grueling decision for most women. And when their child comes knocking at the door, or their email comes unexpectedly in their inbox, they haven't had any time to prepare emotionally and intellectually for this reconnection. They may have kept this surrender experience kind of locked tight in a box that they don't deal with. So you can understand why some birth moms might reject them. It's still extremely painful for the child.
You made a point in also research that most birth mothers fear that they'll be rejected. And like you just mentioned, that the plan that they made is that is quite something to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
But they have this fear that their placed children will never forgive them and that they will reject any reconnection. So we talked about it from adoptees think about it, but birth moms think about this too. And can you explain how this is mirrored by adoptees?
Well, yes, just like when an adoptee considers reaching out to their birth mother, they fear rejection, and it is extremely hurtful because at that point, it feels like a rejection of them. When they were a baby, the birth mother didn't quite know who they were. They weren't quite, it didn't feel quite as personal, although it felt pretty personal. But for a birth mother, knowing that she made this life-altering decision for her child, that perhaps she chose her future in the child's eyes, her own future over the child staying permanently in its birth family, she'll have a lot of very tumultuous feelings about this, and knows that she knows adoption's not a picnic, that it's not always a fairy tale. So they fear that if they reach out to their birth child, that the birth child might slam the door in their face and say something to the effect of, you couldn't make room for me when I was a baby or a toddler. I can't make room for you now. And for someone that maybe has spent 18, 20, 30 years wondering what happened to my child, to have that door closed and never be able to figure out, are they doing well? Are they simply angry at me, or was their life a disaster? It's a pretty painful scenario.
Mhm. I'm thinking about this constellation we talked about. We're focusing on the fear of rejection.
Mhm.
Okay, so, and we've talked about how that shows up in the adoptive mother, how that shows up in the place child, I'll say, or adoptee, and how it shows up in birth mother. Here we are, all of us, that I see this constellation moving around each other, and we're all dealing with the fear of rejection in one way or another.
You know what comes to mind, Susan, is kind of an image of three porcupines on a mobile, all looking to connect. And yet, we've all got our prickles out. Just that's our self-defense. If we can learn to kind of retract those quills and give space to one another and empathy, and move together in rapport that recognizes we're all doing the best we can, or at least I hope we are, how much better that could be for all of us.
Yeah. We talked about creating the space, right? There's a lot of work to this.
Oh, for sure.
Behavior matters.
So yes, absolutely, Susan. I think you're totally correct. And I think that as we look at behavior as a language of communication, we can engage with one another in kinder, gentler ways. We can look behind the behavior to see what is it trying to tell us, and not just be in reactivity. Let's face it, this is a process. It's a whole life's work, because we might not be at that place where we can be in complete rapport, always have empathy and respect. There will be times when we make mistakes, when we fall short, when we engage from reactivity. We just have to give ourselves space too, and then give our kids space and give our children's birth mothers space as well, because they're also going to have days where they too will fall short.
I'm thinking for myself is now I'm building rapport, nurturing empathy, and fostering a deeper connection is where we want to be. And that's, I want to say to our listeners, Gayle's life work, I would say, has been, developing adoption attunement parenting, these principles. And I encourage our listeners to go to our website I think it's on there, Gayle. Is the principles of adoption attunement on the website?
They are.
givefamilyservices.com. But that's not a commercial as much as it is an understanding of the principles, the points where adoption is overlaid everything that you do.
Mhm.
And I think that helps us get into space of creating that, building rapport, nurturing empathy, and creating a deeper connection.
I truly believe, Susan, that as we get into that space, it feels kinder and gentler for all of us, that there's a real benefit to each and every one of us. Not every relationship with birth families is going to work out, but if we always kind of look at them with respect and recognize that they do live on in our children, and so if we can do that with respect, our children can respect that part of themselves as well, instead of feeling maybe soiled by that connection, which if you speak really negatively about a birth parent, your child is going to internalize that. Well, I'm born from that birth parent, so maybe I carry that in me. And maybe if they're a bad person, I'm a bad person. And if they begin to internalize that belief, it too will show up in their behavior.
Yeah, that's what makes adoption attunement parenting so effective, because it's child-centric. When we put ourselves in some ways easier to move away from, well, what did we say at the beginning? We said that adversarial position, that her versus me kind of position. So with adoption attuned parenting, it's child-centric. It makes it natural to follow, because we all want the best for our kids.
Yeah, and if we can tie it back to Mother's Day in particular, we recognize that the truth is our children do have a biological mom, biological dad, as well as an adoptive mom. And in the blog that we wrote last week, we came up with an acronym that we want to deal with our children's birth mothers with grace. And that's actually an acronym that stands for generosity, R for rapport, A for acceptance, C for compassion, and E for empathy. And altogether, that's a grace that we want to offer our children's birth mothers. And as we do that, I think we actually offer ourselves grace because it reflects it. We understand we are all in this together for the sake of the child that we love together.
That's what it means to be child-centered. We're all in this together for the sake of our children. All right, Gayle, that was a great way to come to a close. I want all of our listeners to remember that these are our observations as adoption coaches and adoptive parents. And we know that each of you out there and your family are unique, and your experience may be different than ours. Yet our hope is that you'll consider what I just talked about, adoption attunement practices, as a guide for parenting your adoptive family.
Susan and I invite you to share your experiences with us. Go to the Growing Intentional Families Together Facebook page, and leave some comments and share your thoughts with us. We also invite you to visit our website, read our blogs. There's lots of great content there. You can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. There's a list of recommended reading and annotated book reviews all about adoption. So there's plenty of valuable information there on the website, and it's free.
Tell us what's going on in your family, and let's talk about it. We'd also like to let you know that Growing Intentional Families Together coaches are available to present workshops in person or online. And I want to let our listeners know that we are in the process of creating a special new webinar series for those individuals who are just beginning to think about adoption as a way to create or expand their family. This webinar will answer questions like, what do you need to know? Who can assist you? And things you need to know but didn't even know to ask about. And finally, and I think this is a really special highlight, what you need to know about adoption from an adult adoptee and professional adoption coach who just happens to be mine and Gayle's colleague at Growing Intentional Families Together. Sharon is a wonderful resource for thinking about how adoptees feel. She brings that other perspective from the adoptee's viewpoint.
Yes, that's so true, Susan. So contact us at www.giftfamilyservices.com to explore this possibility.
That brings us to a close for today. I'm Susan from beautiful and always sunny San Diego.
And I'm Gayle Swift from an equally sunny place, Florida, the Sunshine State. And remember, adoption matters. Talk about it, read about it, learn about it. Till next time, so long and stay adoption attuned.
Thank you for listening to Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting. If you liked the program, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help us spread the message about building strong and connected adoptive families. If you'd like more information about Growing Intentional Families Together and their adoption coaches, as well as to sign up for your free coaching consultation, visit giftfamilyservices.com. We have enjoyed being with you and invite you to join us again next time for another Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting.